Leftstickrightstick here with Dream's official tutorial recording. This episode is about logic, the wiring and logic basics.
In this tutorial, you're going to learn all about the exciting world of logic and gadgets. Wait, don't go away! It's a lot easier than it sounds, as you're about to see. Let's check out the scene. See the buttons on the platforms in front of our good friend Connie? Those activate the bridges that will take her to the next platform. At least that's what they're supposed to do. To get them working, you'll need to connect them to the gadgets that control them. You can't see gadgets when you're in play mode, but they let you do all sorts of useful things in edit mode. You can tell gadgets apart by their colour and their icons. Green gadgets are sensors and inputs, and this one is what we call a trigger zone, which is one of the more versatile gadgets. It can trigger other gadgets when it detects something in the scene. In this case, Connie standing on the button. Hi, Connie. If you select the gadget with X, you'll be able to see its detection zone. That's it, right there over the button. Press circle to deselect the trigger zone, and let's look at the next gadget. Red gadgets are movers and outputs, which means they make things happen in the scene. This particular gadget is a rotator, and it's connected to the first bridge. Click R3 to play the scene, and let's see what it does. Well, not a lot right now by the looks of it. That's because the rotator is switched off. You can tell because the gadget is dim at the moment. But if we connect these two gadgets together, we can turn the rotator on using the trigger zone. In the next step, I'll show you how. Before we start connecting things, make sure you can see both gadgets. You'll notice they have ports sticking out of their sides. Ports on the left are inputs, and the ones on the right are outputs. Hover over the output port on the trigger zone now, and you'll see the word detected appear. That means that when the trigger zone detects something, this output will send a signal. Before it can send that signal to the rotator, though, we'll need to connect them with a wire. So hover over the detected output and press R2 or X. You'll notice your imp is now tethered to the ports by a wire, and power ports have appeared on the gadgets. It's these ports that switch gadgets on or off. OK then, drag the wire over to the red rotator gadget, and hover over the power ports at the bottom. Then press R2 or X. Once the gadgets are connected, the wire will disappear automatically. That way, your scene won't get cluttered. You don't want wires flying around all over the place. You can see the wire again by hovering over either gadget. All right, time to test our connection out, so switch over to play mode in the options menu. That's more like it. Now the trigger zone detects Connie when she stands on the button and activates the rotator on the bridge. As soon as she steps off, the rotator stops working. So you can use the button to get the bridge lined up with the platform. Let's take a look at the second platform. See the white gadget on its side? But this gadget isn't a sensor or an output. It's called a microchip. Microchips are used to organize logic in scenes, so you can think of them as boxes of gadgets and wires. Let's have a look inside it. Hover over this one with your imp, hold L1, then press X. It's just like scoping into a group of objects. This window is the microchip's canvas. And if these gadgets look familiar, it's because they're two rotators, with each one controlling one half of this jointed drawbridge. Try to connect the output from the trigger zone to the power ports on the rotators. You can create multiple wires from the same output, or clone wires in the scene by holding L1, then grabbing them with R2. Clone the wire near the rotator to create a new wire from the trigger zone. Once you've connected the trigger zone to the second rotator, switch over to play mode and make sure it's all working. OK, jumping on the button now will activate the trigger zone and raise the drawbridge. So you can cross over the... Oh, wait a minute. The bridge has dropped before Connie could get across. That's because the trigger zone stopped sending the signal to the rotator as soon as Connie stepped off. Switch back to edit mode and rewind the scene with L3. And in the next step, I'll show you how to make signals stay on. If we want the bridge to stay up, we'll need to add a gadget between the trigger zone and the rotator to remember it's been activated. We can do this with a counter. So let's go into the assembly menu. Press square to open it if it's closed. And select the gadgets menu with X. You'll find the counter in the logic and processing section. These gadgets take an input signal and change it in some way before sending it on. Go ahead and select the counter. Its icon is a tally counter. Now that you can see the gadget on your imp, hover over the microchip and it will snap onto the canvas. Press R2 or X to stamp the counter on the microchip, then press circle to unequip it. The counter gadget counts up or down whenever it receives a signal through one of its inputs. By default, it starts its count at 0 and has a target of 1. Once it reaches that target, it sends a constant signal through its counter full output port. Before we connect it though, let's tidy up the wires connecting the trigger zone to the rotators. Just hover over them and press triangle to delete them. Now press R2 or X over the detected output of the trigger zone to create a new wire. And connect it to the increase count input port on the counter. That's the port with the plus sign icon. When the trigger zone is activated now, the counter will go up to 1. And this is the important part, it will stay at 1 even after the trigger zone deactivates. Now hover over the counter full output port of the counter, which is what sends a signal when the counter reaches its target. Create a wire with R2 or X. Connect it to one of the rotator's power ports. Then do the same for the other one. Time to switch to play mode and try out our new connections. As you can see, we have another microchip on the platform. So let's open it up. Hover over it with your imp, hold L1, then press X. Looks like we have everything we need in here. But Connie's an adventurer, so how about we make this last bridge more challenging? Adding a timer to the logic should get the adrenaline going. Once Connie activates the button, she'll only have a few seconds to cross before the bridge drops back down. Let's head back to the assembly menu. If it isn't already open, press square. Then go into the gadgets section. You'll find the timer in the same place as the counter, the logic and processing section. Its icon is a clock face. Now go ahead and stamp the timer gadget onto the microchip with R2 or X. Then unequip it from your imp with circle. Let's take a closer look at the timer's inputs and outputs, shall we? You can see their names by hovering over the ports. The first input is the start timer. Once this port receives a signal, it will start the clock. The second one is the reset timer, which will set the time back to 0. Over on the output side, we have timer finished and timer output. Timer finished sends a signal pulse when the timer reaches the required number, which is set to 5 seconds by default. Timer output is a little more sophisticated. The signal it sends represents the timer's current progress. If, let's say, it's only halfway to its target, it will send a signal that's only half strength. So how do we connect this so the bridge only stays up for a few seconds? Well, we need the bridge to be raised when the timer is running. So create a wire on the timer output with R2 or X. Remember how we used the counter on the previous platform? We can use one here too. Just like before, connect the wire to the counter's increase count input. Then connect the counter full output to the rotator's power port. Time to see if it works. Click R3 to test it. As you can see, since the timer isn't connected to a trigger yet, the clock starts ticking as soon as we play the scene. The bridge goes up, but doesn't drop down when the timer finishes. That can mean only one thing: there's a problem with the logic. If you'd like to figure it out for yourself, feel free to check the gadgets and see what's wrong. Or you can move on to the next step and we'll go through it together. So let's take a look at why the bridge stayed up after the timer finished, instead of going back down. Remember how we used the counter earlier to remember the signal from the trigger zone? Well, now it's remembering the signal from the timer. So we need to make it forget that once the timer finishes. Let's go on over to the counter gadget and hover over the inputs to see their names. This one here is the reset count, which will put the counter back to 0 and turn off the rotator. So all we need to do is connect it to the timer. But to which outputs? There we go. We can use the timer finished outputs. Hover over it and create a wire with R2 or X. Then stretch the wire over to the counter and connect it to the reset count inputs. But we also need to reset the timer, otherwise the logic will only work once. So let's get another wire from the timer finished output and connect this one to the reset timer input. You'll recognise it by the rewind symbol on it. All we have left to do is connect the trigger zone to the start timer port so Connie can activate it. OK, that was a lot of connections. So, before we test it out, let's go over the logic we've made. First, Connie activates the trigger zone, which sends a signal to start the timer. Once the clock starts running, the timer output becomes active, which tells the counter to count up. That then turns on the rotator and raises the bridge. Now this is where the really clever stuff kicks in. After 5 seconds, the timer finishes its count, which activates the timer finished output. This, in turn, resets the counter to 0, cutting the signal to the rotators and lowering the bridge. And let's not forget, it also resets the timer so the logic can be triggered again if Connie didn't cross the bridge the first time. Phew! Isn't logic exhilarating? Take your time digesting all that. Logic is easier to read if you route your wires. Grab wires with X to change their paths. You can move the gadgets around too by grabbing them with R2. Timer on the third platform that makes the bridge drop after 5 seconds. But I think that might be too easy for a seasoned cone like Connie. So let's make it a little bit more challenging. First, if you're in play mode, switch back to edit mode and rewind the scene with L3. Let's move in closer to the microchip with the timer. You can use the grab cam R1 to move your view, and I'll show you how you can tweak a gadget's settings. If you hover over the timer gadget, hold L1, then press square. This contains the settings for the timer. Hover over the sliders and buttons to see their names. The top slider sets the target time for the timer. If we lower this setting, the bridge will stay up for a shorter time. To adjust the value, hover your imp over the slider, then hold X. Use your imp to drag the slider left and right. Set it to around 3 seconds. It doesn't have to be exact. If you are a stickler for precision, you can adjust the slider incrementally, using the up and down directional buttons. Just hover your imp over the slider and press up or down to tweak the value. In fact, why don't we make things really interesting for Connie? Let's set it to 2.5 seconds. You can close the tweak menu now by selecting the cross in the top corner with X. Or you could use a shortcut. Just hold L1, then press circle while hovering over the menu to close it quickly. The same shortcut works for closing microchips. Give it a try now. Hold L1, then hover your imp over the microchip and press circle. Time to test out the scene in play mode. If you have any problems crossing that last bridge, you can always tweak the timer again in edit mode. Remember, you just hover over the gadget, hold L1, then press circle to open its tweak menu. When you're all set, take Connie to the last platform and walk through the door to complete this tutorial.